Howdy my totally as always Tubular gamers, we're back with, you guessed it, another video. I got another year-end video for you. Today we're going to be talking about the hardest games of 2024. Now throughout 2024 I've looked at some of the hardest games that I've ever played, and I thought it would only be natural to look at the hardest games released in 2024. There were some real tough games that actually came out this year, sometimes unexpectedly so. I'm not going to act like this year had some of the hardest games of all time, it really didn't, but there were absolutely some challenging games. So yeah, I thought it would be fun to list the 10 hardest games I played this year and rank them by their difficulty, with each game getting progressively harder and harder. As always, I have not played every single game. I tried my darndest to play every game in 2024, but I wasn't able to play everything, so you can let me know down below if you think I missed a game, or if you agree, disagree, feeling neutral, etc, etc. I'm always going to be lurking down below. As always with my hardest game lists, I'm looking at just an average playthrough of these games. I'm not looking at, oh, if you play this game on the hardest difficulty, or, oh, if you go for 100% the game becomes super difficult. No, I'm looking at what the average person is going to experience, the normal Joe Schmo, and then going from there. I'm also laying down the law here. I am not including Shadow of Erdtree, I'm not including a DLC, I'm only looking at brand new standalone games. If I included Shadow of Erdtree, it would probably be at the top of the list though. As always, please like, share, comment, subscribe. I got the Patreon and the super thanks. Any support is truly greatly appreciated. Apologies if I sound a little nasally today. I've really come down with a cold, unfortunately. But I can't afford to take a day off, and I want to talk about some difficult ass games. So let's get to number 10. So sliding into last place, we have Super Monkey Ball Banana Rumble. Now the Super Monkey Ball series is no stranger to difficulty or challenge. The original two games on the GameCube are not only some of the most difficult games on the GameCube, but genuinely are some of the hardest games of the 2000s. So when I saw they announced a new one and subsequently played it, I assumed that it would actually be pretty difficult. And for the most part, I wouldn't say this is a very difficult game. Most of the stages aren't actually very challenging at all. However, the last, I'd say, third of the game actually does get rather difficult and very reminiscent of the older games. Granted, it doesn't get anywhere near as difficult as the original two games, but towards the end of the game, there were several stages that I spent several minutes on, including one stage that I spent like 20 minutes on. It's easily the hardest stage in the whole game, with the rotating wheels that you gotta run across. This was actually pretty hard. This almost gets it on the list by itself, but there were actually some other difficult stages as well. And really what this difficulty just comes down to is a lot of trial and error. You really gotta understand the physics, you gotta understand the level design, and find a way to best proceed. At least this game isn't super punishing with its difficulty like some of the older Monkey Ball games where they make you do just a bunch of difficult ass stages one after the next. Here, it's pretty forgiving. You can basically try an infinite amount of times until you finally beat it. The stakes aren't exactly raised all that high, and there's not a lot of pressure here. Part of me does kind of miss the pressure of the older games, but I also understand that that is a bit archaic, especially nowadays, and it led to a lot of wasted time. Regardless of all of that, I still think this game has a little bit of challenge to it. A little. So the next game on our list is Mullet Mad Jack. If you're unfamiliar with this one, it is a very fast-paced first-person shooter that sees you basically trying to get through these levels as fast as possible. Your health is tied to this timer that is almost always counting down, and the only way to make it go up is to kill people and drink soda. Yes, that really is the only way to make it go up, and so you'll be trying to go through these randomly generated levels actually as fast as possible, boosting all over, blasting everyone's brains out, kicking doors down, and drinking copious amounts of soda that would make Sheen from Jimmy Neutron blush. Now, I've said it a few times, I'll say it again, I love this game. I think it is just a ton of fun, and one of the reasons I like it is because it is challenging. You actually have to go like as fast as possible, and it'll take a few minutes to really get used to the game's fast-paced nature. Like, you're trying to kill as many of these enemies as fast as possible in the most efficient way possible, while still getting the soda and, of course, actually finishing the level in time. And even on just the normal difficulty, you'll find yourself finishing these levels with barely enough time. The game won't let you have just a shit ton of time in reserve. It really does max you out rather fast, so it really keeps the pressure applied. And then of course constantly getting hit by these enemies or other obstacles that show up in these levels are going to lower the timer faster and faster. I died several times in this game and had to restart the entire floor. When you die, you don't just restart a level like an Angerfoot, no, you have to restart the entire floor, which is 10 randomly generated levels. So if you get to the end of floor 10 and die, yep, your ass is going back to the beginning, and it's as hard as it sounds. But not all is lost. You get some seriously awesome weapons that can kick some major ass in this game, especially once you start upgrading them. Like the base revolver upgraded is actually mad good, the assault rifle gets hella good, and some weapons I'll just say are clearly better than others, but they're all going to help Mullet get through all of these floors. The easiest part of the game, weirdly enough, is actually the boss fights. I never thought any of the boss fights were challenging, and I always thought it was kind of strange how easy the bosses were compared to going through all these floors back to 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 back. There. 10 backs, and sometimes it can take over 10 to 15 minutes to get through these 10 floors, so yeah, there can absolutely be some stakes here, and it can be very frustrating if you get to like the 9th or 10th floor and then you end up losing, but man, this game is just so much fun that I didn't really care. The game is also constantly introducing new challenges, new elements, enemies, and ways to play. The game has a ton of variety to it, and the difficulty really only adds to this game. Alright, so the next game we got here is Dragon's Dogma 2. Now, the original Dragon's Dogma, it absolutely had a bit of challenge to it. It had a little bit of a bite. It wasn't anything like Dark Souls or that level of difficulty, but it absolutely had its moments. In Dragon's Dogma 2, it totally has its moments as well. There are plenty of areas, encounters, and just design choices that do make this game a little more challenging than you might expect. I will just say immediately, some of the enemies hit very, very hard in this game. Sure, you can take a decent amount of hits from these shitty little goblins, but the moment one of these big fuckers shows up, oh yeah, your ass is grass if you get hit by them. Not only are they going to take a huge chunk of your health, but they're also going to lower your maximum health as well. That's one of the more challenging aspects of Dragon's Dogma 2 is as you take damage in the open world, your maximum health goes down, and the only way to really get your maximum health back to normal is by staying at an inn or a camp, and making a camp is not as easy as it sounds, and inns aren't exactly everywhere either, and you can't really fast travel in this game. Fast travel is super limited in Dragon's Dogma 2, well, without the microtransactions, and so unless, you know, you're just not getting hit like at all, you'll quickly find your maximum health shrinking, getting smaller and smaller, and eventually you're going to have to stop exploring, and you're going to have to either get to an inn or set up camp. And some of this can lead to some real risk versus reward moments where it's like, do I want to go explore that new area while my health is already pretty low, or do I want to just go back to the inn and then eventually come back later? But of course, in doing so, a bunch of the enemies are probably going to respawn, and it might take me a while to get back to this spot. You'll be doing a lot of traveling in this game, and it doesn't really ever get all that much easier. Enemies get stronger, they hit harder, and fast travel stays rather limited. Something else that absolutely has always contributed to this game's difficulty is that there's no lock-on feature. You can kind of lock on if you throw your shield up in an enemy, but you can't lock on to enemies in a more traditional manner, which has always been interesting. And then something else that adds even more to the challenge of Dragon's Dogma 2 is that a lot of these quests can be kind of obtuse. This game isn't filled with objective markers all over the place, it isn't super obvious what you're supposed to do, and sometimes it can feel like a guessing game. Sometimes they throw some puzzles at you, sometimes there's even platforming. Some of the quests and side quests can be rather tricky, and it's not always as straightforward as you would think. All of this leads to Dragon's Dogma 2 being decently challenging for the most part. Sure, it's not going to test you like Elden Ring or several other action RPGs, but at the very least it'll make you sit up in your seat, especially when those big ass enemies show up. They really can mess you up in this game. So the next game we got on here is one you might not have heard of, and that is Rabbit in Steel. If you're unfamiliar with this one, it is a cooperative experience that is a mix of a bullet hell and MMO. It goes up to 4 players, and it sees you taking on boss after boss after boss, and you have to constantly dodge all of their attacks while you're slowly chipping away at their health with attacks of your own. And I gotta say, this game is actually pretty fun, especially with a bunch of friends, but one of the reasons it's so fun is because the game is actually relatively challenging. Even on the normal difficulty, you'll be dodging a lot of shit on screen, and you're really going to have to work together. Bosses have moves that will affect both or all of the players, and you'll need some solid communication if you want to dodge all of their attacks. Of course, you can play by yourself and you won't be dodging as much shit and it won't get as crazy, but it's still going to be a challenging time. All of the difficulty in this game comes from dodging these attacks. Some of these bosses can just throw attack after attack after attack after attack at you, and you barely have an opportunity to even attack them back, and they have a lot of health. These aren't quick 2-3 minute bosses. Some of these go upwards of like 5-6 minutes. It can feel like an absolute gauntlet at times, and this is just on the normal difficulty. This game doesn't have a traditional campaign or anything like that. It is structured like a roguelike with plenty of random elements as well, and a run can take upwards of an hour, and if you lose at the end of it, yeah, you got to start all the way over. And with plenty of random elements, of course, sometimes you really just get dealt a bad hand. But I will say, for the most part, that is very infrequent in Rabbit in Steel. You can actually control most of the random elements. and a lot of it does come down to skill. Outside of the normal difficulty, there are some harder ones, and these actually get like really hard. If I was ranking these games based on, like their hardest difficulty and not just a normal playthrough, this game would be near the very top of the list. I've never even come close to beating this game on the harder difficulties. Unless you're playing by yourself, you really are going to need to be playing with experts, and your communication levels need to be off the chain. And the game even has a bunch of exclusive enemies and attacks depending on how many players, what difficulty, and what kind of run you're having in general. The game is actually very adaptable in that sense. So yeah, all in all, this game is no cakewalk. The rabbits might be super cute and you might be like, oh, this game's probably not even that hard, but no. This is a challenging game. Alright, so our next game is Stellar Blade. Now when it came to this game's difficulty, I wasn't really sure where it would fall on the spectrum. It was published by SIE and it was a pretty mainstream game, but it also had plenty of Souls-like elements, and I figured it might have a bit of challenge to it, and it absolutely did. Particularly when it came to the boss fights. The combat in Stellar Blade is pretty fast-paced and you do need some decent reaction times. I would say the combat is a nice mix of a Souls-like and a character action game. It doesn't really fall onto each side and is a nice in-between, and the combat is relatively satisfying for the most part, but you are absolutely going to have to master it if you want to beat some of the boss fights in this game. While I wouldn't say exploring some of these areas or even the normal enemies are much of a threat, some of these boss fights can whip your ass, and there was plenty of fights where I just died over and over and over, but man, when I was finally able to beat them, it was incredibly satisfying. You're really going to have to learn their patterns, you're going to have to understand what all of their attacks look like, when to dodge as many attacks as possible, and of course when you find that opening to just absolutely go in on these bosses. The game also wants you to be super aggressive. Stellar Blade really wants you to play aggressively. The game actively rewards you for being super aggressive, just throwing all of your attacks out there and just trying to hit them with everything you've got, and the sooner you realize that, I think the easier these boss fights are going to be. You also have a really fun, awesome sounding parry, and mastering this really is key to beating a lot of these boss fights. Once you're able to get the timing down and understand the combat and how aggressive it wants you to be, I don't think the game is super duper challenging, but there were still plenty of boss fights, especially towards the end, that genuinely challenged me. I didn't do a ton of the side content, so maybe the game would have been a little easier if I did, but I absolutely found myself struggling with a few of these boss fights, I'm not afraid to admit it. And I want to say the longest it took me to beat some of these bosses were upwards of an hour, which is way longer than I thought it would take me. I thought this was going to be a somewhat casual, more mainstream hack and slash, so yeah, I was in for a little bit of a rude awakening, but it was a welcome awakening. I liked that the game challenged me, and I liked that it really promoted such aggressive play. The game really did become immensely satisfying, and I had a lot of fun with some of these fights, especially once I got the parry mechanic down. So our next game is Stalker 2 Heart of Chernobyl. Now, if you ever played the older Stalker games, you'd know that they actually could get pretty challenging, especially towards the beginning of the game when they kind of just throw you into the thick of it. And I'd say that the older Stalker games are some of the hardest first-person shooters around, and Stalker 2 absolutely joins them in that. This is a challenging game that can be very, very punishing at times. I will say, to the survival aspects of Stalker 2, this game is not really challenging at all. They give you plenty of health items, tons and tons of food, and an overabundance of ammunition. It's pretty rare when you run out of ammo in this game. What makes Stalker 2 difficult really is three things: the introduction, the firefights, and your inventory management. Like the older games, the introduction, it's actually pretty challenging in this game. It almost acts kind of like a filter. The game really just throws you into it. It gives you some really basic tutorials, but you're kind of on your own, and it can be a bit rough for the first few hours, but I can assure you the game only becomes easier from then. One of the reasons the introduction is so hard is really the main reason Stalker 2 is as hard as it is: the firefights. The firefights can be incredibly punishing in this game, especially if you don't approach them with caution. You can get just absolutely wrecked in this game. Enemies can and will headshot you, and you'll die in just a few bullets, if not just one, and this is on the normal difficulty. Sure, you can take out enemies incredibly fast yourself, but they can absolutely just completely shred through your armor, your health, everything. And the game really has no problem throwing you into these scenarios where you're fighting half a dozen enemies at once, and yeah, they'll just rip you a new asshole. They really will. I know it was a few weeks back now, but I streamed Stalker 2 and y'all saw me. I was struggling with a few of these firefights. The enemies will just tear you a new one, especially if they get the jump on you. Like, good luck if they get the jump on you. They're all super accurate because of course they are. The AI is actually pretty decent and they can gang up on you. I wouldn't say the AI is as good as the older games, but it's pretty decent here. And then when you fight the mutants, man, fuck off fighting some of these mutants. The mutants are so bullet spongy in this game and they can just kill you in like 1 or 2 hits. Fighting those invisible fuckers, the bloodsuckers or whatever they're called, they get this game on the list alone. I hated fighting these guys. Fighting the mutants was pretty difficult, and I thought it was quite a bit harder than even the older games. And then like the older games, all of the weapons have durability. If the durability is super low, the gun's going to be jamming every other bullet, meaning you got to reload it and fix it, and yeah, it just leads to a cycle where the game can actually get rather challenging. The last thing I want to bring up is being over encumbered. You have a very limited amount of inventory. You cannot carry a lot of stuff in this game, and it can be frustrating how much you have to drop just because of how limited your inventory is, but that's a core central mechanic of the game as well. Stalker 2, it's not for the faint of heart, but I think it is a really great experience. So the next game we got here is another Crab's Treasure. If you had told me before I started this game that this would be one of the hardest games I played all year, I'd probably laugh. Like, yeah, I'd expect a little bit of challenge, but one of the hardest games I played all year, seriously, the funny little crab game? You're telling me Crab Souls is actually difficult? Yes, I'm telling you Crab Souls is actually pretty challenging. Another Crab's Treasure might look very simplistic and cute, and it might have plenty of moments or areas that aren't all that difficult, but the game has no problem wiping the floor with you in several different scenarios, especially when it comes to the boss fights. And then when you get to the end of the game really does show its true colors. While I wouldn't say the level design or platforming or even any of the normal enemies really tested me all that much, it was the boss fights. The boss fights in this game can just wipe the floor with your little crab. They can absolutely kick your ass. There are plenty of easy ones, don't get it twisted. There were some that I didn't even die to once, but some of these boss fights, I was on them for well over 30 minutes and I was just like, wow, I can't believe how difficult this game actually has gotten. But then once you get to the end of the game, yeah, that's really what gets this game as high on the list as it does. The end of this game can get pretty brutal where you'll have to fight more than one boss in a row and it can feel like an absolute gauntlet, and these aren't easy bosses either. Like, it took me a good while just to beat the first boss only for another one to show up and I'm like, oh, seriously? And it's like this until the end of the game. The final boss and everything around the final boss, it is no joke. It is easily the hardest part of the game, which is, you know, what it should be. The hardest part of the game should be the end, but man, this shit challenged me. This was actually quite difficult. And sure, you can upgrade your crab a bunch, you can get him a bunch of awesome shells that will actually help him out, but even with all of that, even with all these things to help you, the game is still going to kick your ass. You're really going to have to master the movement, the mechanics, and have some pretty good reflexes. On top of course, learning about these bosses, learning their attack patterns, how to dodge their attacks, when is the opportune time to attack, when do you just unload on them so you can over encumber them, or I'm sorry, stun them. I guess I'm just thinking of Starfield out here or something. When you can stun them, yeah, you can absolutely unload on them, and you're going to want to do this as much as possible. Another Crab's Treasure is a really awesome game that is deceptively difficult. Like, maybe I should have known better since it is a Souls-like at the end of the day, but come on, it's the cute little crab game. Is it really going to be that difficult? Yes, it really is going to be that difficult. I absolutely recommend it though. So from one Souls-like to the next, here we have Rise of the Ronin. So this game was developed by Team Ninja, who are no stranger to difficult games. Ninja Gaiden, Nioh, Wukong, Stranger of Paradise, yeah, they've made plenty of difficult ass games, and Rise of the Ronin is no exception. And while I wouldn't say this game is as difficult as Nioh or the Ninja Gaiden games, yeah, it's a difficult Souls-like. It's one that can be very, very punishing and will require really great reflexes. It really has all of the reasons why a game would be difficult in this subgenre. You're going to have to master the bosses, understand their animations, know when to attack, have good reflexes, master the controls in your weapon, and of course keeping up with this game's speed. While certain enemies can wipe the floor with you, for the most part, the enemies don't really give you much trouble in Rise of Ronin. Like the other games I've talked about today, it's the boss fights. This game has some boss fights that took me quite a while to beat, where I just died over and over and over, even with the other people coming in to help you. Yeah, you can actually summon AI to help you. It's a big aspect of this game. It's not like when you summon in Dark Souls. Now, you want these people to come in and help you, the AI, the NPCs that you can actually recruit and level up through side missions. And even when I brought them in, this game still kicked my ass plenty of times. I will admit, I didn't do a ton of the side content in this game. I didn't love the side content. Maybe if I had done a bunch and leveled up all of these bonds and grinded a bit more or whatever, the game would have been easier. But as someone who really just stuck to the main story for the most part, yeah, I found a lot of these boss fights very challenging. And there's a few parts where they make you fight more than one boss at once, and then they actually make you fight bosses in a row, where yeah, it can feel a little bit like a gauntlet. Maybe not as much as Another Crab's Treasure, but I would say this game is more difficult than that because it's difficult throughout the entire experience rather than the last third of the game. Despite the difficulty, man, this combat really is a lot of fun. Parrying is a really great time, and once you master the controls, you can feel like an absolute badass in this game. But the game can also just wipe the floor with you, kick you to the curb, kick you in the nuts, stomp you down, and of course laugh at you. If you're somebody who likes Team Ninja games, you like their prior games and the challenge that they provide, I think you're actually really going to like this game as well. At the very least, I think you'll like the combat, and it'll certainly give you a run for your money. So here we got a small little indie game you may or may not have heard of. We have Black Myth Wukong. Now, when I saw this game pre-release, I expected it to be rather challenging. It just seemed like a game that was going to kick my ass. But then once I started playing it, I was like, huh, this game really isn't that hard at all. It's actually very approachable for the first few hours, but give it some time. Black Myth Wukong is absolutely a game that ramps up its difficulty, and by the time you get to the end of it, this game becomes very challenging. So much so that I would say it's just about the hardest game of the entire year. While the first 10 to 15 bosses I didn't really struggle much on, I maybe died once or twice to each of them, the game really starts actually getting quite difficult. You'll start dying to bosses more than a few times by the halfway mark, and then the last few bosses in the game, really the last chapter in general, yeah, you'll die a fair amount of times to these, unless you're just, godlike at the game. Maybe I'm just really bad, but I died tons of times to the bosses towards the end of the game, and I thought I was actually getting pretty decent. I guess not. Not only do a lot of them just hit like an absolute truck, taking off huge chunks of your HP, but they're just relentless. Some of the last bosses in this game are just absolutely relentless. They never let up at all, constantly trying to get you, constantly attacking, chasing you down. Like, it feels like you barely have any opportunity to attack them. The window to attack them is so minuscule, and sometimes it really can feel just absolutely overwhelming. You've got to stagger the shit out of them, you got to stun them, you got to use all the tricks in the book, because the enemies have no problem just continuously attacking you. It's not like they have a stamina bar or anything. And then the final few fights in the game, these really started to test me. They started testing my patience too. I was just like, when am I supposed to attack this dude? When do I get my turn to attack? It doesn't come. You've got to really just cheese it through and through, use all the tactics in the book, throw the book at them if you have to, because they got no problem drop kicking you and doing like the fucking Hulk Hogan atomic elbow under your nuts, and you're going to die. You are going to die in this game plenty of times. It's going to test you, and the combat can get very, very challenging. I will say though, this game, it is very good at ramping up the difficulty. It doesn't just start out super difficult. Plenty of Souls-likes, plenty of difficult character action games just start difficult and they stay difficult. Black Myth Wukong is very manageable at first. The first like 2-3 chapters, I really didn't struggle with it much outside of the occasional boss fight. It really is in the later half where it shows its true colors, and I can appreciate that. I can appreciate that it ramps up its difficulty towards the later half, but man, that later half is not fucking around. It took me significantly longer to get through the later half of this game than the first half, just because I was spending so much time on these boss fights. But hey, if you're playing this game more, that means you get to see some really pretty environments. I'll always bring up the presentation of Black Myth Wukong. It is a great looking game, but it's also a game that absolutely will test you, it will challenge you, and it actually is a pretty hard game. It's just about the hardest game of this year. It was about to be my hardest game, but then I played something else. Sadly, the hardest game I played in 2024 is the game Chained Together. If you're unfamiliar with this game, it is rage bait. What do I mean by this? It is one of those games that is made stupidly difficult on purpose for streamers and YouTubers to play so that they get mad at the game and entertain everybody. And I guess that's because people losing their shit is pretty entertaining. Okay, yeah, it is pretty entertaining. I was absolutely losing my shit with this game. I tried to play through this game with 3 of my friends, and we just straight up could not do it. You are not going to have a good time with this game, straight up. I don't even think it's all that great of a game. It really, at the end of the day, is just a 3D platformer with some at times questionable physics. Like, this game really relies on its physics. You can play with up to 4 players and all of you are chained together, as the title implies, and all of you are really going to have to work together if you want to get through this just gargantuan feeling game. The game isn't actually stupid long. There's even an achievement for beating it in under an hour, but you're going to have so much trial and error that it feels like it's going to take forever in this game. I tried playing with 3 other people and we couldn't even get out of the starting area. Granted, the starting area is actually pretty long, but we just had setback after setback after setback. This game is overly punishing. If you mess up just one jump, oftentimes you lose minutes, if not over an hour of progress. It is absolutely ridiculous. The game at times feels like it demands straight up perfection, and you're going to be just trying over and over and over, and yes, it gets incredibly tedious. Some of the platforming challenges are just straight up bullshit, where they barely give you any room to work with, where they make people take leaps of faith, and it just takes a long time to do some of these jumps, especially when you have to coordinate with up to 3 other people. Yeah, this shit takes absolutely forever. I couldn't do it with 3 other people on the normal difficulty. So then I played it with 1 other buddy, and we were actually able to get pretty far on the normal difficulty before finally just moving down to easy to see the entire game. And yeah, the platforming really doesn't get any easier. It actually gets harder. The game feels like it takes an eternity also, since it is just straight platforming. There is nothing else in this game. You don't solve any puzzles, there's no combat, nothing like that. It is just platforming challenge after platforming challenge, and oftentimes they'll repeat shit you've already done, but will find new ways to make it even more bogus, even more bullshit. They throw new layers on top of it, and it just gets so fucking annoying, honestly. At the very least, you can save in the game so you can come back later and try some more, but this game really feels like it was made to just piss you off, because it really is just rage bait. I didn't stream this game, maybe I should have, but then you all would have seen me just getting pissed off like I'm DSP or something out here, and y'all don't need to see that. I mean, unless that's what you want to see, then maybe I guess I could stream a difficult game, but I'm never playing this game again. I went through it on easy with my buddy. It was stupid difficult, even on the easier difficulty. And so trying to play this game on the normal difficulty, which is what this list is all about, yeah, not a chance in my mind. This is like the hardest game of the year. And I really wish it wasn't, man. I really wish it was Black Myth Wukong. I think that's a lot better of an experience overall, this game. It's just difficult for the sake of being difficult. I'm sure if you play it by yourself, it's probably not as hard. I never tried this game by myself. It seems kind of counterintuitive since it's called Chained Together. So that's totally an option if you chose to play this game, but to be completely honest, I don't really recommend this game all that much. Like, it's not a terrible game, and it does have its moments, but I really just didn't enjoy my time with this one all that much, and so I would have a hard time recommending this one to anybody. But if you are going to play it, definitely play it with friends, and hopefully you don't hate them by the end of it. Alright, that's the end of this video. I've sounded super nasally and sick this entire time, so I apologize. I'm gonna go get some NyQuil and lie down and take a nap. I recorded my video, so I can sleep in peace now. If you made it to this part of the video, the code word is NyQuil, because man, I'm fucking sick again. I always get sick around the holidays, and then I gotta record shit, and then I'm looking back like a year later, and I'm like, this sounds terrible. What am I doing? I'm ranting. I should be lying down, going and getting some sleep. So, I'll see you all later. Bye-bye now.